Hey everybody. Before starting the interview, I want to say a few words about why I had this conversation. I strongly believe that it's important for us to discuss controversial issues. Open civil discourse has the power to lead us to creative and peaceful solutions. When there is no conversation, dehumanization follows, and violence after that. I, for one, do not want to live in a society where people resolve their differences through violence. I know we can be better. Hey everybody, my guest today is Professor Holly Lawford-Smith, and we're going to talk about sex and gender. All right, Professor, why don't you introduce yourself?
So I am a associate professor in political philosophy at the University of Melbourne in Australia. And for the last 5 or 6 years or so, I've been working mainly in feminist philosophy, but like as the annoying, how do you put that? The one that they all hate, like the one that's not invited to any conferences, but is like sitting in the corner criticizing everything that's going on. So whatever you call that, that's what I've been doing for the last little while.
Thank you for that. So you wrote a book on sex and gender, and I was hoping that you could give me a summary of it.
Yeah, so I actually kind of wrote 2 books in close proximity. One was a monograph called Gender Critical Feminism, and that's not the one we're talking about today. And then the next one, which came out the year after and was more academic, was a collection of 9 papers or essays. And I guess the difference between the two is that the Gender Critical Feminism monograph was aimed at kind of saying, what is this new feminist movement? How does it relate to mainstream feminism or kind of orthodoxies that are generally accepted by academic feminists? And then the second book, the collection of essays, which is called Sex Matters, that was sort of more aimed at taking up a specific topic or application of gender critical feminism, which is its disagreement or dispute with contemporary trans activism. So Sex Matters is really like dedicated to disagreements or arguments between a certain sort of women's rights activist like myself and a certain sort of trans activist or maybe most trans activists.
So where's the disagreement then in regards to the conception of what gender is?
The big disagreement is that there's been this shift over time from a second wave conception that sees gender as external. And I think that's a really helpful analysis that we can't do without, at least until we have gotten rid of those external constraints. So the idea there is that there's something that is imposed on people or done to people on the basis of their sex right from birth. And that might be done by parents or peers or marketing or the toy aisles being segregated or books sending different messages to boys and girls or, the encouraging of different personality traits or ambitions depending on whether you're a boy or a girl. That stuff has a really long history. It sort of changes its form over time, but it's still going on. So the second wavers were very interested in what they would call all that stuff femininity for females and masculinity for males. And they were really interested in stop doing that to people on the basis of sex. If a boy wants to be a ballet dancer or wear a sparkly thing, go for gold, express yourself, do what makes you happy. So they were really interested in stopping the imposing or doing of that external stuff to people on the basis of sex, which would make everyone more free and have more options. And the thing that we're seeing now in the trans activist movement, and that's being really sort of chair-led by academic feminist philosophers, is this idea that your gender is some sort of subjective sense of yourself, and it's up to you to self-curate that thing or self-determine. It's an important part of your self-determination to decide where you sit on a spectrum from masculinity to femininity. And somehow they I would say conflate, they would probably say identify that with gender. So it's okay, if you feel more masculine more of the time, you're a man. If you feel more feminine more of the time, you're a woman. And they have an interesting, I think there's something in there that I agree with, which is it should be up to you what you're like. That the second wavers agree with that, right? They think female people should not be forced to be feminine. It should be up to female people what they're like. And you could be very masculine, you could be a tomboy, you could be hyper feminine, all of that would be fine. So that the crux of the shift is really this thing from an external set of norms that should not be imposed on you and we all need to fight against, to this internal sense of self that you get to choose. And so for the trans activists, gender like justice looks like getting to pick, whereas for the second wavers, gender justice looks like getting rid of gender or being a gender abolitionist.
It sounds like from what you're saying then that from, I guess, like your perspective, gender is kind of like gender normativity, and that is imposed by society onto the individual starting from birth. And it's something that should be dismantled because it's oppressive, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. And then what they're saying is that gender is some sort of subjective identity. I get the sense that when they talk about gender, it's something that's core to who they are and that it's something that they're actually born with. I feel like trans people say that they're born trans.
Yeah, I think that is the rhetoric. It's there's certain sorts of commitments that seem to come along with how they talk about it, as though. So I think one way to put it is that it's this trait that is immutable, and now the other word is escaping me. Innate. Strange mental blanks. Innate and immutable, right? So there's this thought that gender identity operates in a roughly comparable way to sexual orientation. So plug in your folk beliefs about how sexual orientation works, the born this way narrative, that people really struggle to accept that fact about themselves, and it can be a really long journey to do so. The idea is that whatever gender identity is, it's roughly the same type of thing. It just affects whether you are a man, you are a man or a woman, rather than whether you are gay or straight. And I think that narrative by analogy has been very successful because it's easily digestible by the public. But I'm not sure it's true. There's not much empirical support for that. There's empirical evidence of gender dysphoria as a phenomenon, but like a very small percentage of the current cohort who identify as trans have that, would meet the diagnostic criteria for gender dysphoria. So I think there's a sort of new thing going on. There's an idea that is like getting a lot of uptake that the way you feel about your femininity or masculinity should be called man or woman or non-binary, and that for some reason it's really important for everyone. Because there are trans people, it's something like that. It's like because there are these people for whom it's really important, and it's this innate, immutable thing, and it causes them a lot of distress. It's really important for them, but then somehow I don't know quite how to explain that step from that to the next thing, that it's like it's really important for everyone. It's like, because no one thinks just the sort of non-binary blue-haired college girl is trans, but somehow her authentic expression of her gender, it gets caught up in this whole new movement around like shifting to think of gender as a self-determined thing. So there's something interesting and a bit strange going on there.
Yeah, I'm afraid I don't know all the nuances of this debate. Like I know with, in a large enough community, there's going to be internal disagreement. And I think one such disagreement is whether or not you have to have gender dysphoria in order to be trans. I don't really know what the majority of trans people think on that issue. But I don't necessarily have an opinion either. I thought, or I used to think, that you had to have gender dysphoria. And that was the reason why a person would transition, because they were just so unhappy with their bodies, One question I have for you is this. Okay, so there are these two competing conceptions of what gender is. Let's say that you isolate a human being from the rest of society. Let's say that you just have this person who like lives in a cave or lives on a deserted island.
Yep.
In that scenario, is there such thing as gender under your conception of what gender is?
This person is alone on the island.
Yeah.
Absolutely not. Yeah. I mean, the only way there would be if that person like grew up in a gender saturated society and then had like a plane crash or something and then was living alone. Maybe it would take them some, they could arrive with like very strongly internalized senses of how they were supposed to be. And it could take them a long time to throw those off, or maybe they would never throw them off, depending what sort of thinker they are. But if you somehow had like a baby cast out there and then raised by wolves or whatever the story would be, then I think there would be no gender at all. So it's this essentially social thing. And I guess, on the second wave conception, there is this interesting question of like, this perennial debate of how much of it is. So that's one of the big disagreements among feminists of that type. Like, the ones who think there's more biology in it will think that you could put a boy and a girl on different islands and let them grow up, and you'd probably still see some differences in like risk taking or certain sorts of personality traits. I mean, most people that talk about this acknowledge that these are just kind of averages. So you might get statistically unlucky and your two children on the separate islands are just like the unusual types. And so then they might cross over in traits, or they might turn out to be roughly the same. But yeah, that is a kind of ongoing dispute about the extent of what we call femininity and masculinity, how much of it is socialized or a result of culture and how much is biological. And I think there's been extensive evidence that shows that nowhere near what anyone ever thought was biological is biological, but there's some little bits left that we're arguing over, and sort of it remains to be seen.
Yeah, that's interesting. So like returning to this thought experiment of the person living on a deserted island, I think that may be an example that shows the disagreement between the two conceptions of gender, because I think a lot of trans people would say that you could still be trans on an island independently of, what society thinks and independently of like where everybody else lives, because it's really this like desire to change the body and to be different. Would you agree with that?
It's really complicated because I think that's quite an old-fashioned conception of transness relative to the current discussion. So yes, there is this what would have used to be called transsexualism, and that conception, I think it's true because it's so much to do with the sexed body that we imagine that even when a person is alone, they could still have the feeling that this body is wrong. That's sort of in the same ballpark as I'm now forgetting the technical name for it, but the sense that your limbs are wrong, like shouldn't be there. So you really just have the sense of yourself as that the right version of yourself would be missing the right arm or whatever. So I agree with you that way of thinking about transness as intimately tied to the sexed body and a kind of dysmorphia about the sexed body, that we would still expect that to show up for the solitary person on the island. But the much more common kind of contemporary conception, it need not have anything to do with the body. And indeed, it need not have anything to do with expression, which is super hard to get your head around. I can sort of get my head around the shift from the sexed body because the trans activists will say, well, that stuff's all largely hidden, right? So if you're like a drag queen would used to tuck the penis, right, so that the dress can sit flat. Okay, whose business is it whether you've got a tucked penis or not, right? Because like that might be your partner's business and maybe your doctor's business. Like there's a very small set of people socially who need to know like what genitals you have. So yeah, if you're appearing and passing as the sex you identify with, maybe this question of the body is really sort of beside the point. Like you're getting the life that you want to have without those changes. But now there's this kind of movement. Trans women don't owe you femininity. Trans men don't owe you masculinity. So it's not even the body. So I should have said as well, the surgery rate has drastically dropped over time. So now it's around 90% of trans women that don't get surgeries to change the don't get bottom surgery or whatever it's called anymore. So there's like the model is like femaleness with a penis or whatever. But now, there's this like push into gender expression. So it's like a person can be a trans woman and be like a butch lesbian. So I can't say it without laughing, but it's like that is a masculine man. It's a male who's a masculine man who's heterosexual as almost every other male is, and he's just wearing his jeans and his cowboy hat or whatever. But he can be a lesbian woman. He doesn't owe you any sort of gender expression that's female-like or female-typical. Just like women can be women while they wear pants, so too can he. So then it becomes really confusing. What is actually the content of that thing, or what are they identifying with or as? And then you try to translate all that onto the island. I don't know what I feel like they'd need at least one other woman to be the template to say that I'm somehow not right as myself and I need to be more like that thing. So that seems like an essentially social notion to me.
Yeah, I'm not really sure what to do with that case. So it seems like that there is this umbrella term and this is large and diverse group. Perhaps we can make a distinction between like, I don't know what you want to call it, like the old school classical trans people and maybe like the newer generation, younger generation trans people that maybe differ on this, right? Because the trans, like, so I recently interviewed Sophie Grace Chappell,
right?
And she was of the, she like her desire is to change like how she appears to other people and her body. You know, there's like this dual element there. She wants, and she'll say that, you know, biology is sex and gender is like psychosocial. I think that's how she delineated the two, right? But now you're saying that you have these other trans people who actually don't have a desire to change their biology necessarily.
Right. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm not really.
And it's even interesting in Sophie Grace's case, because he has said in interviews earlier, maybe he's just like on a trajectory, but he has definitely said that he doesn't have surgery in mind in the future. So I always read him as having this, like, it was more about the presentation. And I sort of get that historically too, right? Because he's an older person. So it's like probably femininity was very much more discouraged in boys when he was growing up. And so those options feel forbidden to men in a way that like transness makes permissible. Whereas like for younger generations of men, you see now, especially in communities like fashion design communities and gay communities and so on, or anything in the arts, like you can express yourself much more in that way without needing to make recourse to this claim that you really are a woman. So I don't know. I mean, yeah, maybe, who knows? But I guess it's probably just idiosyncratic, like for each trans person, which things it seems important to them to want to change. And yeah, if you're really aiming at the experience of kind of fully passing and like having as close as possible to the experience of if you had been born the opposite sex versus if you kind of want to be subversive. Like, I guess every community has that politics, right? Like, do you want to be, you're gay? Do you want to just have a quiet life and have gay rights? Or do you want to be like on the front lines of the Pride March, always asserting that you're gay and that it's okay to be different? And like, yeah, so I'm sure that those same impulses probably just show up in every political community, and so too the trans community.
So I noticed that you were using the male pronoun there, the masculine pronoun there for he. And I guess this is my next question, which is, these gendered pronouns, do they necessarily have to be connected to a person's biological sex?
I mean, I think the quick answer is no, right? Because, and I can't remember where I read this, but it was right at the very beginning of my like interest in this area, where I just read a piece that was like, why are you being such a dick about pronouns in the trans case when you use them for boats and storms and like all sorts of other things, and you know, robots, for example, is another example. Yeah, like given that we're so sort of generous and flexible with them anyway, what's the big deal here? And I guess the thing is, it's a big deal. Like, I would feel differently about I tend to use trans men's preferred pronouns, for example. So I think there's a huge difference because there's a feminist objection to men claiming to be women. It's asymmetric, and it's not just a matter of like kindness or doing what a person prefers. It's like there's also this whole other baggage of like going along with this ideology that you disagree with, or using social conventions that signal that that person like is or should be accepted as a woman. Yeah, it's an interesting tension because of course it's rude, right? Like, and of course you noticed it. Like, it was jarring to me that you called Sophie Grace Chapel she, and then it's jarring to you in return that I call him he when I reply. And it's certainly like, I think the convention is to see that as being like quite rude and quite disrespectful. But yeah, part of the feminist, I think it's morally wrong for men to claim to be women. And I think they're usually claiming something that if they really thought about what they mean, it would be indefensible. So I don't really want to go along with any of what that involves, even though I'm a hypocrite sometimes, because sometimes when those people are my friends, I put interpersonal things being good between us first. And so I will just go along with it. But in private, I don't like it.
Interesting. Okay. So I'm wondering, it sounds like that the reason that you're against it is for political reasons, right? Yep. It's not a personal attack, even though I think some people will construe it to be rude. But you're doing ultimately for like this larger goal, which is to fight a political battle.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So I guess I want to get back to a more theoretical question, which is like the nature of gender here. So is it possible to have different notions and different senses of gender? Like that a woman or a man can refer to two different things, right? Because I've read some stuff about how some people will define a man or a woman, right? And they'll say, you know, adult human female or something like that. And the response that I read sometimes is that, well, even that word adult can have multiple meanings, right? It could be you could be a biological adult, you could be a legal adult, maybe even like a social adult, as in someone who's like responsible, right? So is it possible to be a woman in like a social sense, but not in a biological sense?
I mean, I don't think, and again, this is just everything is political for me. So I don't think it's helpful for feminist politics or the goals of feminist politics, which are women's liberation or women's equality, to have a conception of women as a social role. And so I don't think it's helpful actually to say something like, well, woman is polygamous and you have these 5 senses, and one refers to like the one who stays home and does the childcare. And so of course trans women can be women in that sense because they can be carers or whatever. I don't think that's helpful. And I think anywhere that you were going to identify a social role, you probably want to knock it out. And then invoking this other allegedly super oppressed minority group who want that role and need that role, that's going to be really dangerous for feminist politics. Because if the idea is to name the role so you can challenge it and get rid of it, but then you're like, I was trying to think of a good parallel for this yesterday, and tell me what, maybe it's stupid, but I was thinking, like, imagine the climate change activists are really anti-meat for carbon emission reasons. And then there's like this big campaign about like the vegans with iron deficiency disorders discovering meat, and it's like so good for their individual health, right? And then but then we start touting that this minority group is like really like made so much better off by meat. I think the climate activists could get mad at a certain point at this like using of this vulnerable group as cover for what then turns out to be like a pro-meat propaganda campaign when they're anti-meat. And of course, people are going to be like, don't pick on them. Like they're like a vulnerable minority who have been made better off by meat. Like you should be picking on the rich men, right? Who are having meat for luxury reasons rather than picking on this group whose health was compromised and who really have been made better off. But I think that's what trans is to gender. It's like, yeah, they are this kind of like vulnerable minority because they have this distress around their expression. And of course, it can look mean to be picking on them when there's so many other people to pick on. But it's like the way that progressive politics works, that it like really picks up those minorities and starts like, yeah, this is so great. Like meat for iron deficient prior vegans and woman expression for previously gender distressed men, whatever. And then it makes people think those things are good. So it really does set back the progress of the political movements because people want to be for that minority. So it's those dynamics that I think are really interesting.
Oh, okay. I never thought about that analogy before.
It's a bit weird, I know. It's maybe not perfect yet, but I was just trying to think of a structural sort of analogy.
When I read and hear about trans people's stories, I often note that a lot of them are characterized by a lot of suffering.
Yeah.
Especially when they were younger and they were just trying to figure out like who they were, and there's just something about them that they didn't like. And I know a lot of trans people feel this discomfort with their bodies starting from the age of 4. So like starts really early and it continues on. And anything perhaps that is like gendered may like trigger this dysphoria or at least this discomfort with themselves, like maybe every time they go into a gendered bathroom, right? Every time they have to go shopping for clothes, every time people buy them gendered clothes for Christmas, like it's just every instance of their day, they're faced and they're reminded that they are not the way that they want to be. Yeah. And I feel like when I read those stories, like I feel like the appropriate initial response is compassion. Yeah. Right. Like I just see this group that has suffered so much, and that people who are not part of that group really don't understand. It's to the point where like it just doesn't make sense to people who are not in that community, and that makes it harder for our society to kind of accept them, and so like to allow them to kind of live the way that they want to live. I see there are two aspects of it, right? There is this personal struggle, but there's also the political struggle, right? Yeah. And it's where this political struggle is where you're kind of like butting heads.
That's correct. Yep, that's correct. I noticed that what you said about that distress can be alleviated in multiple ways. So it would be in a much harder situation if it was like trans people's and women's interests just clashed and it was a zero-sum game. Like there's just no way. You have to choose which group's distress to alleviate. But I think that's not the case. So one way that you could alleviate that distress is the gender abolitionist future that the second wave feminists wanted. Because what's causing that boy distress? Oh, that he keeps being given male-coded Christmas presents or whatever, or that they're, so all these things in the world that say that because he is male, he is expected to do or be X, Y, and Z. That's what the feminists want. They don't want that. They care more about women, but they don't want anyone to be typed in these ways on the basis of their sex. So there's a sense in which like trans people could come on board with the feminist project and we would all get what we want in the future. But one way of getting them what they want, which is not worrying about the feminist project at all and just trying to fit trans people themselves into the existing status quo, that way of doing things is bad for feminism because it just shores up the existing categories and it makes them much harder to abolish because it sends the message that like this really vulnerable minority group need this thing. And so what we should care about is alleviating their terrible distress by treating some men as women and treating some women as men. But don't worry about all the women whose potential has been frustrated by being treated as women from birth. So I guess I'm just a little resistant to this. Yeah, I know it's not what you were saying, but it's like what compassion looks like at that very first step where someone just tells you who they are or how they've been suffering. That's not the end of the story, right? Because that's not how we normally make decisions. It might be how we deal with things interpersonally. Like we might just choose to go along with something because we don't want to make someone's already hard life even harder. But when it comes to like political trade-offs and what we think the future looks like that we're aiming for and what we should all be working for, yeah, we can't just stop at that point, I don't think.
So I think when I was a little younger, I was more of a gender abolitionist. I didn't like gender normativity at all. In fact, I made active efforts to break gender normativity. And I think upon reflection, I don't actually think that all of gender normativity is bad. I don't think it's intrinsically bad. I think there's certain aspects that I think are bad and are unhealthy, and as a society, like we really need to get rid of it. So for instance, like men don't cry, right?
Yeah.
Like that is something that is unhealthy that needs to be abolished. The fact that some people wear dresses or some people wear pants or some people have long hair, some people have short hair, that I don't see that as being intrinsically bad.
Because it's sort of trivial is your thought. Like, yeah, maybe it's constraining people and maybe it's like frustrating some people's desires, but it just doesn't matter that much. Is that why?
Yeah, right. But whereas other aspects of gender normativity are pretty oppressive, right? So if gender normativity says that, oh, if you're a woman, then you shouldn't go into these professions, or that you should even have a profession at all, you should just be at home. That I find that very oppressive, But if you want to have long hair and you're a woman or whatever, it's not like for you to be a gender abolitionist and to fight against oppression, you necessarily want people to not embody any gender stereotypes at all, right? It's like so I guess like in a utopia, in the gender critical utopia, do people just kind of look the same, or there's not like this gender differentiation in terms of like hair length and clothing style?
Look, I think this is resting on like a subtle conflation in what gender abolitionism means. Because gender abolitionism, it means abolishing the thing that second wavers think gender is, which is the imposition of these norms on people on the basis of sex. So there's no clear implications for what the distribution should then look like once those norms have gone away. It might be that like, for whatever reason, people just love to stratify. Like we've seen plenty of evidence, there are goths and there are punks and there are skaters and there are the tattoo guys. Like, so people do like to stratify, and maybe it just turns out that like no matter what we do, one of the lines along which people stratify will still be sex for some things. And so maybe there will be some like normatively very light conventions, like women tend to have longer hair and men shorter, or vice versa. Maybe that thing, if there was a difference, like it would be important to note that like, yeah, there's no stigma. So the boy who wants to have long curly hair and style it every day with his GHD curlers, like he's not getting any flack from anyone. And it's just like it's a light kind of convention at most. Yeah, so it's not that the gender abolitionist utopia couldn't have any differences that track sex on average. It's just that there would not be strong expectations that are associated with social rewards and punishments that track sex. And I do take your earlier point that like the things we really want to care about when it comes to sex stratification are things like career opportunities or expectations about having children, things that really affect how people's lives go and how much pain they experience and what risks they take on and so on. But I think I still do want to sort of bundle it all together and say like, that it's really damaging to little boys' self-expression and creativity, that they're discouraged from the dress-up box, anything that's colorful and has a sparkle to it. Like, okay, of course that's not as bad as being forced into a certain sort of job, but it's still quite bad for their human potential. And so I do think it's important to get rid of all that stuff as it tracks sex.
So what you just told me makes me think that I guess there's more to this political struggle, right? Because you can imagine, like, no matter what type of political policies and social institutions that you have, that individual parents will still impose these gender norms onto their kids, right? So it's going to be the dad or the mom telling the son, "Oh no, don't play with that. Play with this instead," right? So how would you get rid of that?
Yeah, I mean, this is really a social revolution, not a legal or policy revolution. And I mean, I guess there's this perennial question, which I don't really fully know how to solve. And I think I should, as a political philosopher, figure out my view on it. But this question, right, about when it's appropriate for the law to take a leadership role rather than a following and implementing the will of the people role. And, there are some legal reforms, especially relating to equality, where states, maybe not so much in America, I don't know, but in Australia, where states do seem to feel really emboldened to take the lead, even if there's no mandate. Whereas there's other things where like it'll be a 3-year consultation and then it'll get shot down. So I don't know exactly between those things what the strategy should be for the gender revolution. But I always err toward thinking we need to like collectively recognize that these things are stifling people's potential and causing all sorts of harms, and that we should not want them. And the thing that I find so frustrating is that like this is all old news in a sense. So for philosophers, it's quite a weird position to be in, because it's like they were saying all this in the 70s, like in the late 60s and 70s and 80s. And they made enormous progress. Like if you know that Lego ad that just has a little tomboy girl wearing dungarees and Lego blocks, and she's just got her hair scraggly and wild. And it's like there was this form of sort of gender neutral type parenting. And there was a big push toward like equalizing kids' responsibilities and let kids be kids campaigns. And it's like we've kind of gone away from that again now. And I'm not sure if that's entirely, is it a backlash? Is it partly the trans inclusion focus? Like, is it something else? I don't know. Sorry, I just lost my train of thought from what your question was and where that started. Sorry.
What is your position on like female only spaces?
That we should have them and they are important.
Okay. And that means excluding trans people or trans women from those spaces?
Yeah, it means excluding all males from those spaces regardless of gender identity. And that's not to say that there might not be some spaces for some purposes that were previously sex separated where it wouldn't make more sense to track self-described gender. I can't think of one, which is weird. But I mean, I can think of cases where they're not so much social spaces, but they're provisions for women. So the example that I usually use it's a real example. It comes from a trans woman that I know. This is where I look like a hypocrite because it's a friend, so I say she. She took a scholarship for women during her studies, but she had been like passing as a woman for 20 years or something and was like stealth. So in that case, I think, like everyone thought she was female. Any discrimination that would be facing women in philosophy at the time would have been facing her. I don't see any big problem there, actually, that she's taking a scholarship. Like the fact that she was secretly male, I don't think is a good reason to be like, well, these are opportunities for females that she's removing. But yeah, something like the women-only domestic violence counseling group where there's someone who is evidently male, I think that's quite different. I think that's really serious. So what conceptually it's possible that there's some spaces that are women only where it doesn't really matter if we shift from sex to gender identity, but there's lots of spaces where I think it's important that they track sex. And we have to say that because apparently policymakers don't see any problem with, they think that they think that there should be separated spaces. They just think that any trans person should always count as an exception to that rule. So all men with gender identities, as well as anyone female. And that can really like throw the dynamics and the interpersonal trust and the shared experience and everything else off in those groups.
So what about bathrooms? Do you think that those are they should be one of those protected female-only spaces?
I think bathrooms is a really interesting case. And that's why I had this like hesitation about doing a chapter in the book on bathrooms. Because on the one hand, whenever you talk about women-only spaces, everyone jumps to bathrooms. Like that's the paradigm case. And that happened a lot in the media in Australia when this discussion was starting. And it's a bit annoying because there's many more important spaces, like prisons is much more important. Women's sports is much more important. And the kinds of counseling and like domestic violence, rape, alcohol addiction, and so on, recovery groups, I think are really important as well. And lesbian dating is really important. So there's lots of women-only spaces where the question of trans inclusion has higher stakes. Bathrooms are like you go in for a few minutes and you kind of, the stuff happens quickly and the chances are really overlapping with anyone. So yeah, there are reasons to talk about them and reasons not to talk about them, but I ended up deciding to talk about them in the book. I think I ended up concluding that it would be fine to shift to fully unisex bathrooms so long as they were self-enclosed rooms. So that there's all these trade-offs once you start considering every single stakeholder, like children being safe going to the bathroom between certain ages without accompaniment, which is easier for the parents, blah, 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 like the rooms being tidied. So women often complain that men are peeing everywhere and then they're more dirty. Okay, but once you trade off all of those things, it's like if you have a floor-to-ceiling sealed door, like nowhere in America, by the way, and you have a hand basin in the room, then that's like an acceptable way to trade off everyone's interests. And I think, again, I can't quite remember because it's been a while since I read it, but if you've got this situation of stalls with shared hand basins and gaps, then it's more important to have sex-separated bathrooms, and you could just add third gender spaces to the building provisions. So it's like the more risk of voyeurism or privacy violation or shared social stuff there is, the more important it is to retain those as sex-separated. I think that's roughly the way that I went.
Interesting. Okay. So the general idea that I'm getting in terms of why it's important to protect female-only spaces is to reduce harm to women? Is that the idea?
Yeah. So there's like a bunch of different rationales and they'll be more or less important depending on the space. So safety is one major rationale, and it's going to feature in things like, I think in mixed sex changing rooms, for example, in the UK, it was shown that there was more prevalent, I can't remember now, but it was sexual assault or voyeurism, certain sorts of crimes related to privacy violations. So that's a safety concern. So too would be like sport, like you get your leg broken more easily in rugby if you're tackled or whatever. So that the harm reduction safety concern is there. But if we're talking about women-only spaces across the board, there's all these other rationales as well that get get less airtime, but can still really matter. So the like shared bodily experience is one that comes up for bathrooms that people will talk about. So women like having a miscarriage in a public bathroom and then being able to rely on the support of other women who might have been in that situation or can relate in the right way to that situation, or having period blood bleed through your clothes and needing to be like half naked washing your pants at the basin, or like rinsing out your moon cup. Like, so there's all this stuff where it feels less of a humiliation or a privacy violation to be doing that in front of other women who share those bodily experiences or are much more likely to have shared them with you than with a man. So there's things like that where, depending which space we're talking about, these other things like privacy, comfort, shared experience, fairness, so on and so on, kick in. So I've got this more general paper in the book that's just like, I think it's just called Women-Only Spaces and the Right to Exclude. And it tries to like pair up almost all of the types of spaces with almost all of the types of rationale and see where that leaves us in terms of the question of like trans inclusion or exclusion.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that this discussion is always about female-only spaces. I never hear discussions about male-only spaces and how we need to protect male-only spaces. And perhaps it's a sign of just this deep and historical unfair relation between men and women, right? Men are the threat. Women are not the threat.
Yes, I think that's right. I think especially when it comes to things like sex-related incidents, so the fear of sexual assault or voyeuristic crimes, like apparently this is quite common in South Korea, the recording with the phone over or under the bathroom doors. These things like this that are related to sex, I think that tends to be asymmetric in who perpetrates the crime and who it's perpetrated against. And then, of course, you've just got an average physical difference that's going to affect, like who tends to be the perpetrator of physical violence, whether it's sexual or not. One thing that is interesting on men's spaces, though, it is true that it gets less airtime, but gay men, I think, also have a conflict of interest here when it comes to trans inclusion. So, for example, the gay sauna culture, that is now being threatened by lots of girls coming in claiming to be boys and claiming to be gay men because of their identity. And then there's this question of maybe it's not threatening, right? So no one's complaining that there's a safety risk, but they are complaining that it's really deeply uncomfortable, that there's no sexual interest, right, in these girls because they're girls and they have vaginas. But there's a question of how to negotiate, pretending to be inclusive of them in the sauna culture. And I think that is an interesting conflict of interest that we could be giving a bit more airtime to as well. And then, of course, there's just this question of there are some men-only spaces like men's sheds, for example, for men's mental health and social well-being, where I think it's perfectly justified to have them. Then maybe the discussion is a bit different to women-only spaces, but they're still serving an important social good, and that good would be threatened. I think there's something about the solidarity with other men and relating to socialization under masculinity, where that good would be threatened by the presence of women, even if only because then largely heterosexual men start competing for sexual attention or whatever. So then there would also be an issue of what about a trans man who's visibly and obviously a woman coming into that space, especially if she's primarily there motivated by validation of her identity as a man, which comes up in some of this discussion, whereas the men there are really dealing with social isolation and wanting to make friends with other men and learn these skills. And then they've got this sort of person there creating these new problems or at least throwing up these kind of questions. So I do think that the question exists for men's spaces, even if in a bit more limited way.
All right, so let's kind of bring it back to the personal. Let's say that you had a kid that came out to you as trans. How would you react to that? And what would you do?
My own child, or you mean a student?
Your own child.
I think my preferred approach to claims of trans identity is this sort of watchful waiting. So that's not to deny that it's possible. It's, I think, to say something like, well, you might be, but there's a lot of other things that might be going on as well. And let's just make sure that you're really diagnosing this feeling correctly. And this is the approach that's recommended by GenSpect, for example, which is one of the more gender-critical organizations aiming to provide an alternative to the medicalized approach to claims of gender identity. And then I think if my kid was female, the two conversations would be different, right? Because I think with female children or adolescents, there are a lot of reasons why they might want to opt out of femaleness or not want womanhood as their future. Things relating to beauty objectification and the excesses of pornography at the moment and what they're being expected to be by their peers. So I think you want to have a feminist conversation first of all. Are you really not a woman, or are you really not what your culture is telling you a woman is and has to be like? And what's the best way to fight that? Do you have the strength to fight that as an individual and help make things better in the future for all other women? Or are you in such a bad place yourself that you really just have to opt out and claim to be a man and try to pass as a man and do the best you can to hang in there? And that's going to depend a lot on your child's mental resilience and strength and so on, right? And I don't know, I mean, maybe I'm fantasizing, but I feel if that was a boy child, it would be a different conversation. But I would really want to know what is it that he thinks a woman is that he can't be and do as a boy, right? And then if it turns out that's things to do with getting flack for how he's dressing or expressing himself or what he wants to be like or who he wants his friends to be. A lot of that I do think can be resolved without claiming to be trans and without getting on this pathway of needing like cross-sex hormones and all the sort of medical risks of that. So I think you definitely don't want to be like shutting anyone down and telling them that they're wrong about who they are, but you want to make sure you're having a conversation about finding out that really is what's going on, rather than one of the other many things that could be going on in its place. And then what? In the case that they really were just one of the extremely rare people who have childhood gender dysphoria and it's persistent, what's the phrase? Persistent, insistent, and consistent, and they really like are distressed and they're going to be happier living in this alternative role, I think I would probably support them in doing that. But I guess my armchair suspicion is that more likely it would be something else going on, and hopefully that could be resolved.
So I wanted to get a better idea of this term male socialization that you use in your book. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so that is just supposed to refer to all the ways that male and female babies and then small children through adolescence, like since birth, have been shaped by other people, inherited like social institutions, culture, basically everything that would fall in the basket that's not innate biology. So the socializing of male people into masculinity and the socializing of female people into femininity. And I guess it's really significant in this debate over trans women's inclusion in women-only spaces, because you have to put your finger on what is supposed to be the justification for keeping males out of women-only spaces. If it's biology, then there's nothing the trans woman can ever do, right? Because he can't change his biology. We can argue about that because some people think you can, but I think take for granted that you can't. But if it's socialization, well, okay, then it's going to depend a little bit on, there's like a little more flexibility there. So, maybe it's like, well, at what age does that stuff like most dramatically set in? And so that might give you some flexibility around thinking like a male person who transitioned socially early in childhood and then passed as female and so was really treated as and shaped in the way that female people are, would be at least expected to be like more like female people than male people. And it gives a clearer sense of the disagreement. So when radical and gender critical feminists say that like a 60-year-old man that went through life in the military or some other like hyper masculine set of social institutions and practices and then decides he's a woman after being the father of a 5-child family or something for his whole life, now he's a woman because he wants to wear these like sexy type clothes or whatever, why are they going to sort of think there's a much more serious challenge and problem there? Because his biology aside, like he's had the 60 years or whatever of social conditioning and social treatment, and he's likely to bring those attitudes, behaviors, expectations, or whatever into interpersonal interaction with women. So that's the like basic idea there.
Okay. And if I'm understanding you correctly, it's this male socialization part that makes men a threat to women?
Yeah, and it's important to say that there's no entailment there to like an all men claim. And this is just maybe anticipating the least charitable of the audience of any podcast, right? But that you can talk about female and male differentiated socialization without it being then a counterexample. If you can find one masculine woman and one feminine man, of course you can find plenty of feminine men and plenty of masculine women. And there's a really interesting question about like what explains when people are atypical or outliers. So it's just a sort of general way of referring to the social practices around how we treat the sexes differently. And of course, there's also this thing where people can do more or less work in that regard, right? So men can be feminists or feminist allies, and maybe you take a class and you find out about these ways that children are treated differently, or you think about that time in your childhood where you were a boy who really wanted to do ballet, but your dad sort of made his irritation or disappointment really clear right? So you can sort of isolate those times where the norms, the sort of rewards and sanctions attached to the norms have kicked in and kind of like shaped your own behavior. So there might be some men out there who would really say like, oh, I know where I was socialized, but I am free of that now and I've thrown that off. And I think that's a bit of an implicit assumption in the trans activist kind of contributions to the debate. They just tend to think of being trans as like a kind of magical shield that like it bounces off all attempts at gender socialization. So if a little boy is actually a trans girl, what they would call a trans girl, then no such masculine socialization could possibly be working on him. So the very fact of his transness is kind of this protective force. So he's ignoring all that socialization and he's maybe acting like a sponge, picking up the socialization that he relates to more or identifies with more. And I think that's the charitable way of how you could end up thinking trans women are more like women than men, and then not being able to understand the radical feminist and gender critical feminist reluctance to just like fully integrate those men into women-only spaces.
So the way that I see a lot of these ethical issues is that there are usually disagreements on like two dimensions. One dimension is like the empirical, and the other is like the value stuff, right?
Yeah.
So this sounds like a combination of both. So there seems to be an empirical claim here that maybe like a couple of different empirical claims, like one, male socialization tends to make men more of a threat to women. And if you go through this male socialization, then you're susceptible to that. And since some trans women have gone through this male socialization, they should be placed in the category with cis men, right? So there's,
that's right.
Okay. So then what would have to be true in order for your position to be false?
Good. Before I answer that, can I just comment on your phrasing as like them as a threat, males as a threat? Just to be clear that's like, it's really broadly understood. So it's not just being a threat to women's physical safety or sexual safety. It's like threat to women's interests, most broadly understood. So if what we're talking about is a like female empowerment group on campus or something, the question of letting in a male non-binary person, it's not that we really think they're going to be a rapist. It's more that like, what does it do to the solidarity between women to have a male in the room? In what ways can that like disrupt the interests that the space is set up to protect? So that's just a clarification. Okay, so your question is, what would it take for the male socialization hypothesis in general to be false, or you're asking about the specific application of that to trans people?
Yeah, the specific application of that to justify excluding them.
Yeah, I mean, I guess obviously if you could prove that there's just no such thing as sexed socialization, or if you could prove that there's just some better explanation of what produces the behavioral differences that we see. So maybe it's really class, or it's really race, or it's really culture, something like that, then that would get you away from sex and onto these other variables that trans people could more easily have. It's hard for me to see how there could be a falsification in blanket terms because of the heterogeneity of the trans community. And so I mentioned already like the difference between the child who has gender dysphoria at like age 5 and is socially transitioned and passes, compared to the like military man who's had a family and transitions at age 60. Those people are worlds apart. So yeah, I guess it could be that you could prove for some subpopulation of the trans women cohort, just empirically, that male socialization isn't working on them. That seems like something you could fairly easily study. And they've done this work looking at gender non-conforming boys. It's like feminine boys. It's just that there's a kind of difficult to disentangle question of whether that is a gay-linked phenomenon or a trans-linked phenomenon, because almost all effeminate or feminine little boys, they grow up to be gay, and some very tiny number of them grow up to be trans, and it's really hard to separate early on what's the likely future, or even to disentangle whether trans is just a kind of socially constructed version of the gay trajectory. But you certainly I could easily imagine setting up experiments where you can show these gender non-conforming little boys. In fact, I think there's ample testimonial evidence of this. Like the parents really sanction them, the schools really sanction them, they're getting lots of bullying by peers. but they're still showing up in a sparkly feather boa or whatever. Like they seem to have this irrepressible femininity or whatever. So I think you could at least show something like that, like socialization failed in some cases, and you could try to bolster the evidence that it fails, especially in these like maybe gay, maybe trans kid cases. But the important thing to note is that just would not get you the 60-year-old military man. And it would not get you the like Judith Butler inspired gender fuck or gender queer cohort where they seem to be more doing like gender experimentalism as a kind of identity play or a way of like politically subverting gender norms. And I don't even know how. It may be interesting to speak to someone who does this kind of empirical work about how you could even set out to prove that. Like, I guess you can isolate the cohorts. So you get your blue-haired, genderqueer, like all college student males who identify as non-binary or trans women, and then just like go through their average traits, personality traits, behaviors, interests, hobbies, all the work that your male scientists desperate to prove sex differences would do on men and women. Just do that work on the gender diverse male versus gender non-diverse or gender homogenous male. Just do that there and see if you can show the differences. But as in the debate over the sex differences more generally, there's still always this question of like, what is the ultimate explanation of that? And if it's just like, well, really, they have all these attitudes and behaviors and impulses that they were socialized to have, but it's so important to them to socially signal their female likeness or non-male likeness that they're masking very well. But I don't know how you could tease that out. And again, super interesting question. How could you design an experiment aimed to get at that? And maybe you could.
Yeah, I don't know how to design an experiment like that. But I'm wondering if we can derive any guidance from just like how our society is today, and I guess how our society might be in the near future. Because it seems to me that there are certain locations and states and countries that are, I guess, more trans-friendly and more trans-inclusive. And so for those territories, they are going to, I guess, have data in regards to like how the inclusion of trans people is going to affect a particular traditionally protected woman's space, right? So let's say if it turns out that including trans women in some sort of like shelter or refuge doesn't, increase violence or there's no tendency for the violence that we normally attribute to, like cis men or something like that. Like, do you think that would be informative at all?
I think that would be super informative. And actually, this very observation was behind my first big cancellation. So to jump ahead, the lesson of the story is that no one is collecting that data. So that data would be absolutely crucial to settling what is that dispute between gender critical feminists and trans activists, but literally no one is collecting it. And it's considered like extremely taboo to even suggest that it would be good to collect it just to be precautionary or make sure. So there's so much political animosity to the idea that trans women could be male-like that's seen as really undermining their identity or disrespecting them or dehumanizing them or whatever, that we can't do it. So back in, I think it was, now I'm forgetting, 2020 maybe, I spoke to a Tasmanian politician in Australia about this question of women-only spaces because Tasmania had just introduced self-ID for legal sex, and Victoria, my state, would soon introduce it. And we were talking about whether anyone is collecting data. And even if it's not things like violence, it might be things like self-exclusion, right? So you can imagine the women only swimming hour at the local pool. Now you start getting men coming because they self-identify as women, and all the like Orthodox religious women who can't be partially nude or whatever you call that around men just start self-excluding. So you would need to be tracking not just like, was there a rape or was there a sexual assault or was there a voyeurism incident, but like changes in patterns of who feels comfortable or who still feels like the space is for them. And this politician said, that no one, Tasmania certainly is not collecting that data, and that data would be really important to have to be able to like bolster our case, but also if we're wrong to bolster the other side and say like, look, the fears that women have, at least around their safety, are unjustified. So let's move on to whether there are other things at stake. So I started this website, which I don't know if you've heard about, but it was collecting anonymous testimony from women who use any of this big variety of women-only spaces and services to see whether they had a personal experience of males starting to use those spaces and how they had experienced those disruptions. And that attracted like a lot of negative media attention and a sort of 6-month multi-pronged university disciplinary investigation, because it was seen as vilifying the transgender community by even asking the question of whether trans women had been kind of disruptive in these male typical ways. So I think it's like a super interesting question, but that's just to tell you some of the politics around trying to ask it.
Yeah, there was a lot there. Let me try to think about like how to unpack that. So one point that you made, it was something that I agree with you, is that it seems that the data will be important to also disprove your argument, right?
Yes.
So if because I have faith that people will believe anything if it's true, right?
Yeah.
And so if given enough evidence, then, I would hope that people are willing to, change their mind, right? So you think that the data would be important. I'm not sure. Yeah, again, like I don't do this type of research, so I don't even know like the best way to collect that data. I think if it comes to something like maybe sexual assault, that might be easier to gather. But if it's something like discomfort, or being uncomfortable, then I feel like it's a little softer, I guess, in terms of how you would measure it. Because I don't know. I feel like there are definitely like methodological difficulties with doing something like that.
It's also tricky, right? Because then the opponents will just say, "But that's bigotry." And then you have to fight over that.
So that is another question that came up when you were giving your response, because I can imagine, so let's take something like public display of affection, right?
Yeah.
And, there's certain limits that we draw as a society, rightly or unjustly. I'm not going to weigh in on that, but there are certain limits that we draw in. And for me, it's going to be here. Maybe for somebody else who's conservative, it's going to be two guys kissing on the subway, right? Yeah. And, the more liberal types are going to say, well, that's your problem, right? Like you really shouldn't be disturbed by that, So I can imagine that there may be like a parallel element there, which is maybe some women are uncomfortable with it, but it's really because they're just not open-minded enough. Like they should be more inclusive.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I guess the only thing we can then say back there is that there is a kind of hypocrisy in that liberal response, which is that they don't say that when it's about a man who doesn't identify as a woman. So there's something really inconsistent in like, oh yeah, it's totally fine in the shared gym changing room to not want to get fully naked in front of a man, where that means a male with a man gender identity. But the moment you make but I don't want to get naked in front of a man with a woman gender identity, you're suddenly a bigot. And so I think that's like, at least if the liberal would be consistent and say, look, sex distinctions need to be broken down. So it's your discomfort around males is unjustified or is a form of like sex profiling that we would object to in the racial case, whatever. At least if they're consistent and say you're a bigot no matter where you experience that, then I think I would find the argument more persuasive or harder to respond to. But the fact that they think somehow women are supposed to have this selective identity responsive discomfort where they're completely innocuous in one case and then a bigot in the other to an identical looking man, I just think that is like, it's so ridiculous as to be. I just don't know what's going on with them when they make that claim.
Yeah, it's tricky because also, like you said, like the trans community is diverse, right? It's not homogenous. So you have people who present differently, who transition at different stages of their life, at different stages of transition, I think maybe because of just like my personal experiences with trans people, I feel that their concerns are legitimate. I feel like that there is something going on there. Like it is something that is important to their identity. And I think that because that they have this particular gender identity, I assume that it would push them to live a life differently than if they were like a cis man or a cis woman. And I think that's where it's coming from, and maybe that's how.
Sorry.
Yeah, I know. And I'm just thinking that maybe other people have that type of same response. Like it is something that seems to be very important to people. Like, I don't think that I can deny that. I don't think we can deny that. And so it must have dramatic and serious and fundamental effects on how they would want to live their lives.
But I think I can certainly accept that point. But the thing that women have an interest in is how successful is that. They could have the best intentions in the world, right? But the question is how successful their so-called transition is. And if it isn't particularly successful or it's only partial, in what ways does that like affect negatively women's interests? And I think a really useful parallel for people that are just like instinctively want to put compassion, what they see as compassion first, and then like not think through all the implications. Think about how different cultural transition is, right? And how easily it shows up. So you could have a German who moves to the United States and loves like the culture of whatever state he's moved to. It still shows up all through his accent, his habits, like how he celebrates Christmas, or Christmas is Christmas Eve, right? Like, there's all these tells. And even if he's like passionately identified with the new culture, you know, meets an American woman and starts a family, is going to have American kids, like it's still that there's all these little signs. Even if he wants to like integrate and fit in as much as possible, these tells are just absolutely everywhere. And we can do that. We can run that thought experiment for every like case of cultural integration that has ever occurred, and how long it takes to like get the language and dialect perfect. And some people kind of move somewhere when they're 20 and they're still a bit feeling like an imposter at age 90. So I just want to apply that thought to crossing over of sex. Like the more dramatic our sex differentiated like social situation is, and I would say it's very dramatically different. It's not as dramatic as Victorian times, right? Or the 50s even, but it's still quite dramatic. And like you can like if an alien came, they can tell who are the women and who are the men, right? Who are the males and who are the females. And there's just this like, yeah, how successful is crossing over and real passing and real not being kind of a statistically typical version of that type. And I just think it's probably really hard. And I can accept that trans women are making a sincere attempt to do it, and still think the likelihood of a success there, like full success, is really low. And so being asked as a woman to accept the claim that they're probably just really like any other woman because they're sincere, yeah, like I'm very skeptical about that.
Yeah, I guess I'm not necessarily saying that there wouldn't be tells. It's a hard issue to kind of think of a comparable analogy, because I think the experience is so unique, you know, and I think, again, like anybody who isn't trans, I don't think it's really fully understandable. So like, for instance, like a German moving to America, like one thing that seems to stand out to me, or at least stands out to me when I hear about trans people's personal journeys, is that they've always felt that something was wrong, like starting when they were kids, you know, like starting when they were even like 4 years old, right? And it's something that they cannot explain, you know, and I don't think anybody else can explain it either, right? It's just something that they feel deeply, and they're questioning things. They're kind of like confused, and then as they get older, they start learning more and more about themselves and learning more and more about like what's expected from them, you know, and then, you know, they experience, you know, just more discomfort, and then maybe it gets to a point where they realize, I'm trans. This is the thing that I've been feeling my whole life.
It's tricky because what you're telling is such the like propaganda story. So it's like that is the perfect case for public consumption of what it means to be trans. And I'm not denying that there are trans people like that, but it's like as a proportion of the cohort, the person who has that perfect childhood gender dysphoria story, where it truly was persistent, consistent, and insistent, and where it was the right thing for them to transition, and where it's not like they might possibly be misdiagnosing discomfort with their sexuality or rigid norms about what masculinity means in that place as this thing trans. Of course, it can be one thing that feels like a solution, but then it can be 10 years later, you feel really distraught because you've had these unnecessary surgeries, and you figure out you could have just been a gay man, or you could have just been a hairdresser, like the straight man of the family who just happened to have this atypical interest. So I don't know, that your story doesn't remotely capture the one I keep coming back to, which is your like 60-year-old man who didn't have any of those feelings, or your 20-year-old college student who would never have thought of any of this until they read Judith Butler, or one of the people inspired by the Judith Butler suite of ideas. So I don't know, it's like, even if somehow I'm very impatient about that archetype, because it's like, even if that person exists, and even if it's easy to be sympathetic to the thought that like they surely would have had this like very different socialization experience, what would it be? 90% or more of the rest of the cohort? They're just nothing like that. And then the arguments are just so much weaker. And then again, what, women being asked to just pretend for the sake of the 10% or whatever the percentages are, that there's not, right, simultaneous with like actively protecting their interests in sex separation where they matter, but just making these ad hoc exceptions that correspond to the will of activists. That it's just, yeah.
Yeah, and again, it's hard to talk about a group that's large enough that has like internal disagreements and that isn't homogenous, right? So like,
Yes,
like I know trans people have like gone through that, like that is their story, right? It started really young and it's persistent, stuff like that. Yeah, I don't really know much about like what the statistics are, what the demographics are, but like, yeah, okay, there's probably like different type of trans people, and then maybe the umbrella is so big that incorporates people that certain trans people under that umbrella would not accept those people under the same umbrella, right?
yeah.
So I think I've seen that before too. Like there's like gatekeeping within the trans community. Is like, oh, like I'm really trans, but you're not really trans, and
That's right.
you're right. And yeah, I don't really know like the nuances. That I just know that disagreement exists. So this kind of relates to the other part, which is given that there are people who have gone through this, right? Who really have struggled with this, and they're really happier, living as the other gender, right?
Yep.
Is the concern that you can't separate those people from, I guess, the other people who would still more likely conflict with the interests of cis women? Like you can't separate them out? That's not the issue?
That's not the issue. The issue is still that they are male, still that they are likely male socialized, and still that like their sense of their own identity just doesn't seem to present a very like strong or relevant case that is overriding of women's interests in having women only spaces. And again, it will depend exactly on the space and then exactly what the rationale is for that space. Maybe some like it's easier to make the case for trans inclusion than others, but it's not, it's emphatically not, oh, well, it's just hard to tell the difference between the trans women that really are women and the ones that aren't, or the predatory man who might just be using that as a cover but isn't remotely trans at all. That's not the problem. The problem is that the difference that matters here is sex, not gender identity. And so it doesn't matter how compelling a trans character you come up with in terms of gender identity, still not sex, he's still male, and that maleness still matters a lot of the time.
I see. Okay. So is the solution creating 3 different spaces? Like, I guess I understand the exclusion part, but then like, what if, you have trans people who need access to particular services, or they need to be placed somewhere, like in the case of like prisons?
Yeah. It's interesting from a policy perspective, right? So you say third spaces, right? So what is the presumption there? That we ought to respect everyone's identity claim in terms of like parceling up social provision, even when it's in response to violent crime? Is that so? What we shouldn't? Because one default answer would just be we have a sex-separated prison system, and we should stick with that. Why would it be that because certain men have a way they feel about themselves in terms of their masculinity or femininity or neither, that requires new prison provision? Like I think there's already a lot to be argued for right out of the gate there. And I can see there are some spaces where it's like the costs are lower, so like, for example, at University of Melbourne, which is my uni, that all the new builds build in 3 types of bathroom. So it's female bathroom, male bathroom, and then like, I can't remember actually what they call them. Maybe it's like gender neutral. There's some Australian inclusion accreditation scheme that says you can't call it unisex. You have to use the specific language, which is deemed like the current progressive gender language. So whatever it is, that's what those spaces are called. And there's these third spaces all over campus now. And yeah, if you're doing a new build anyway, and you've got of course, universities are that's where you're going to get a demographic that really cares about this stuff and like is the age where there's more of this gender diversity going on. Yeah, it kind of makes sense. Like you can partly resolve that problem by providing third spaces, and then in a way everyone's happy. Actually not true at UniMel, because they also declare that anyone can use the bathrooms they prefer. So essentially people who wanted female-only spaces have lost them, while gender diverse people have gained this like option of a third space if they want it. But yeah, when it comes to something like prison or even sport, right? So again, from the starting assumption that you, as you framed your question, the thought would be like, oh, well, because men don't want to play in men's sport, we'd better make a trans category or like an open category that everyone can compete in. And again, it's like, what is this thing of just accommodating this particular group's wish? Like, we don't do that for anyone else. So what exactly is going on there?
Yeah. So I guess it would be different if we're talking about prisons or sports. I think maybe for prisons, like I suspect that a trans woman would be like in danger and in high risk of getting hurt, like more so than like a cis man would be in a male prison. Like you.
All beta males are at high risk in prison of getting hurt, like effeminate males in particular, right? Because there's such a stratified pecking order.
Yeah.
But I think you're probably right. The question is, why does that push you to think he should then create a risk to women in the women's prison? Is there a like implicit value ordering of like who needs more protecting or whose interests matter more? And I don't mean to criticize you. I just mean that's a very common impulse in the public debate, that people are like, oh, but the trans woman's at risk in the male bathroom. Oh, the trans woman would get raped or beaten up in the men's prison. And somehow people's go-to solution is like, chuck him in with the women then. Like, as though that's the end of the matter and there's like nothing further to consider.
So then do you think in response to that particular issue, the disagreement is empirical? That the people who are more trans inclusive are just disagreeing empirically? They're going to claim, no, trans women are not more of a threat to cis women than, cis men are.
Yeah, I do think that's probably a large part of what it hangs on. And prisons are a really interesting case, right? Because we don't respect all the normal like liberties and interests that we would outside of prison, because prison is supposed to be a punishment. So where I might give you, like, if we're just talking about women-only spaces in general, I might give you a list of 9 rationales, and then we could talk about women's interests in each of them. Most of that can just be swept aside in prison because it's not supposed to be a comfortable, respectful experience, right? It's supposed to be, in some sense, punitive. So I think that's right. If you could really establish that, like, putting some men in the women's prison and then really isolating that demographic and empirically checking, I think that probably is what's at stake. And it is the thing that really matters most in that context. Like, and you can see that playing out in the debate. Gender critical and radical feminists, they're so anxious about especially the cases where they put trans women sex criminals into women's prisons. So it's people that have convicted of pedophilia or rape or other forms of sexual assault. And then because of their identity claim, they're being moved into the women's prison. That's a clear safety risk to women, and it's a clear prioritizing of male interests over female interests. But I think if you could do empirical work to show that, something about being God, what would it, again, it's like, what would it even have to be? Because it can't just be claiming to be a woman. There has to be certain gatekeeping to make sure it's sincere, given the incentives that would create for male prisoners to want to go into the nicer prison with sexual access to women. But maybe, if you could come up with some diagnostic criteria, like they had to have childhood gender dysphoria, or they had to 10 of the people that know them have to give statutory declarations to say that they are extremely effeminate. I don't know what it would be, but maybe there's something like that, where if you could show that cohort just has a very low propensity to sexual violence, and so make the case that they don't pose that particular threat to women, then I think that would at least strongly reduce the objection to their inclusion from my side, and bolster the case for inclusion for the trans activist side.
Okay. So again, that's going to come down to the data, right? Yeah. So, okay. All right. So then in terms of sports then, right?
Yeah.
Do you, what is your proposal? Do you think that trans women should compete with the males?
Yeah.
Okay. What about those cases where they take hormone therapy?
So there's been some interesting work on this, and it looks like the real disadvantage spectrum kicks in because of male puberty. And the problem with this is that, then that makes a prima facie case that any boy who did not go through male puberty because he took puberty blockers and then cross-sex hormones, he should be able to be included in the female category because he doesn't have the physiological advantages built by a male puberty. There's some issue on the margins about there's an earlier, I think, prenatal burst of hormones, and there's a question about what the significance of that is. And so that's still to be resolved. The tension that creates is that a lot of us think child transition is really bad and really experimental and risky. And so we want to advocate against medical or surgical transition, before the age of adulthood. So you don't want to be telling trans communities, oh yeah, your little boy can get the full experience of being a girl, in all respects, including sports teams, if only he goes on puberty blockers early enough, because then you're incentivizing medical transition that we're opposed to. So there is a bit of a tension there. But I think it's true that that's ultimately an empirical question too, and that's why so much work has been done on not only the sex difference in performance, but also lots of newer work on the effects of 40-year-old men or whatever taking estrogen for 2 years or whatever. And as I have reviewed it, which was a little while ago now, but it looks like it's not possible to fully remove the sex performance gap. And I think they did it up to, it was either 2 or 3 years on cross-sex hormones. There was still like a really notable gap in performance in particular metrics. And again, depends on the sport. But empirical question, but the evidence is not looking favorable to their side. And one proposal that maybe is like appealing, I think John Pike and others defend the idea of a female only and then an open category. So that makes some concession to trans identity claims in the sense of like it wouldn't force trans women to compete in the male category and so self-identify as male, which some people think creates some dissonance. So if it's just like female only category and you have to be biologically female to be in it, but there's everyone else, then you could put all non-binary, gender diverse, trans women, trans men on testosterone, everyone in that category, and everyone's competing there. So that's one solution.
Yeah, I feel like in the area of sports, it's perhaps one of the more solvable and addressable issues. I interviewed Joanna Harper on my podcast, and she's a trans athlete and scientist, and she does research on this stuff. And one of the things that I asked her was about the science of going through like a male puberty and masculizing puberty. Yeah. And she said, no, the evidence is clear that it makes you stronger, faster, and then would give you an advantage for in most sports. So her proposal was to say that for trans women to compete in women's sports, they have to bring their testosterone levels down to female typical levels. So that was like one of the standards that she said. And then
at a time though, right? Like bringing the testosterone levels down at a time ignores the entire history of what the male puberty built. So I don't understand how that proposal was.
So I asked her about, something like bone density, right? Because I've heard some mention about that. And so we got into a little bit. She's like, yeah, bone density could help you. It depends on the sport, right? So it's like, and she said, generally speaking, like trans women are going to be bigger because they went through, male puberty. And she was saying that, like, at least I don't fully remember the conversation happened months ago, but there are also some disadvantages for being a trans woman, in terms of sports, because you're now something to do with like you have a bigger frame, but you have like a smaller engine. Like she made it an analogy with.
This is like it constantly trans activists go on TV saying this because I just find it such a stupid claim. Like, no offense to her, but Ada Chung does the same thing. Unimel endocrinologist. They make this claim about like, oh, it's like putting a really weak petrol in a big SUV or something. It's just like somehow the petrol at a time is supposed to fully weaken this enormous beast of a machine. It's like, I just think it's so implausible. There's these, so you mentioned bone density, right? But it's like male puberty creates a wider shoulder on which muscle mass gets packed. So your, whatever it's called, wingspan or whatever for swimming and all sorts of sports involving like shoulder strength, that doesn't change because you've taken cross-sex hormones down to 10 nanomoles per liter at a time. So that you'd have to account for all of those sex differences like constructed by male puberty and then look at whether like the mere reduction of your testosterone to what is still 5 times higher than the female average is really making like fair competition between males and females. And regardless of what those activists say, I just, from what I've read, and again, maybe we're all arguing about which is the credible stuff, it's just not plausible that it's reducing or eliminating that advantage.
It was apparent that in the interview that she would adjust her stance depending on what the data showed. So if it were the case that trans women just like dominated women's sports and you had enough data to make a convincing case, then she would say that you have to adjust the requirements and the parameters. And that kind of makes sense to me, right? Because you want to be data first, I guess, right? Like you want your data to inform your position. So if it were the case that we could figure out some parameters to operate with some parameters such that trans women, just didn't dominate women's sports, that, and in fact, just I guess on average they would perform as well as cis women, would you then be okay with it?
I just don't know how we're supposed to work this out given what sex differences are like, right? Like it's not categorical and distinctive. It's these like huge distributions that have like different tails. So I don't know, then what? Like slightly more trans women will tend to be these effeminate type boys or whatever. And so they're going to be like a little more weedy on average, but then you've still got your like your 60-year-old transitioners who were just like typical masculine men and did a lot of male typical sport. I don't know. So it's like, what, just because trans women aren't dominating women's sport because you had some luck of the kinds of men that end up claiming to be women and playing sport are like not particularly competitive, but the general rule is permitting any male who wants to claim a woman identity, Leah Thomas, for example, to just then be eligible for the women's competition, and the kinds of threats that that creates to like the interests of women who have been training hard all their lives. I don't know how you could make a rule like that gets that right. It's not about performance at a time, and it's not about whether trans women are coming in en masse and dominating the competitions. It's like there is this physiological fact about male puberty and what it does, like, and then we have measures of that, like on average. Yeah, what would you even do? Like, you make a good rule, and the best rule to my mind that is data driven seems to be sex distinguished. Or you'd have to go extremely case by case. Like every time there is a trans woman who wants to play on any like community level or elite level sport, yeah, you're really having a look at him. Is he kind of like weedy and more in the female typical range than the male typical range? And like, what's his hormone level, if that matters? And like, what's his muscle mass and what's his punching strength and flex, like all the things they measure. Maybe you could do that if it's like, and then I think that really depends. If it's really so important that he's included, if you make such a compelling case that it's like you should bother to do all that work case by case to settle the matter, then maybe we have to do that. And again, this makes me come back to the heterogeneity of the group, because it's like the rhetoric is often, oh, like it's so important to him to be validated and to have his identity upheld by other people, and what he's going to kill himself if that doesn't happen. That makes it really seem like, yeah, anything we can do, we should do. And if there's some cost to women's interests, or yeah, they've been training all their lives, but like, don't worry because he's suicidal. Like, yeah, I don't know. The more you can elevate his need, the more of a case you can make for doing all the extra labor to figure out his inclusion case by case. And the more you can justify stamping on some women's interests to some extent. But I think those claims tend to be like hyperbolic and magnified for political purposes. And they don't apply nearly as much as the activist rhetoric suggests that they apply. And so I think the trade-off in the public realm is being decided somewhat unfairly.
Yeah, one of the things that I noticed about this particular issue is that it raises questions about the more general notion of fairness, right? Because there are certain, I think Joanna Harper makes this distinction between competitive advantages and categorical advantages, right? So even how sports right now is delineated between the sexes, I mean, it's not equal, right? I mean, you do have some people like Michael Phelps who's just born like a human fish. And I'm hesitant to say that that's fair to anyone that he swims against, right? So it's almost like we have to figure out a way to respect categorical advantages. And I think Joanna Harper is in favor of that. If the advantages are big enough and wide enough, I guess statistically, then it would justify some sort of like categorical distinction to make the sport more fair. So if we're okay with that, then I guess the question would be whether or not that advantage would be big enough and wide enough to justify separating trans women from women's sports and maybe having like an open league or something like that.
Yeah, I just don't know what you would expect to see, but because of course, like you could, because of the numbers, right? If you just got rid of all sex separation, you would expect men to win because it's like roughly a 10% performance gap, but that's the gap between the elites in any given sport, right? So like the tennis men can beat the tennis women greats or whatever. But if you're just introducing this like 1% or less of the population of trans women to the women pool, they're evenly spread across this distribution from superhero to nerdy weed. Yeah, maybe you're not going to see what looks like a categorical difference because that's just a facet of the distribution and the small numbers. So yeah, I'm not really sure what to suggest in terms of like what is fair there. I mean, I think the point you make about Michael Phelps is interesting in the sense that like we can get the intuition that it's about interest in competition, right? So when someone just idiosyncratically is like so far above the rest of the cohort, you can always predict that they're going to win. It's just boring. It's like that's not interesting for the spectators, and it's not, I don't know, if there's prize money at stake, it's just, that's not the art form is somehow being subverted. So we could all recognize that this is a a superhuman in an interesting way, but kind of still want to like knock them out of the competition for some reason. And I think this comes up a bit with the debate over intersex athletes too. But yeah, I think I would have to think about it a bit more, but I'm just thinking that the empirical strategy might not work for trans inclusion, but there might still be something a bit unfair going on. So I just have to, think through a bit, what is really the objection there to that like kind of approach in terms of what the outcomes would be.
Yeah. The other reason why I bring that up is because, when I hear people who are critical of allowing trans women into women's sports, it almost always comes from the assumption that trans women are going to dominate women's sports. That once you allow them in, then, this cis woman is no longer going to win that gold medal, right? And usually, like oftentimes when they raise that concern, I think it's unfortunate because I think they tend to make fun of trans people at the same time. Like people will make parodies, right, of this buff guy, but he puts on a skirt like, oh, I'm a woman now,
Yes.
And I'm like, and I think that's unfortunate, right? Like you can have these legitimate disagreements without making fun of them,
No, I mean, that's a fair point to make. I can sort of see where it comes from because women are so frustrated with this conflict of interest not being taken seriously. And I think there is often this impulse then to veer toward being unkind or making the point in these dramatic ways where the South Park version, right? You've got your like huge bulky guy and it's intimidating to the other women. I guess I'm just trying to process as it's like, it's true. I would still have the intuition, even if you put a trans woman who's like quite weedy into the female competition, like cycling, let's say, and then he won one of the first 3 places medals, so he knocked some woman out of going on further, or he took prize money, I would still have the intuition that that's unfair, that he has taken something that was reserved for women and it would be like akin to the intuition about him taking any prize or scholarship or whatever else that had been like reserved for women. So I just don't quite know what to do with that. Like maybe my intuition is unfair because if we have established that he's within the distribution to be competitive with women, then that should just be the end of the matter. But maybe it's something like he's always got an advantage over what's the comparable woman? It's like somehow he's a mediocre male, but he's competing well against these more elite women, and that difference is explained by the advantages of the male puberty. So he's like doing better than he should be doing were he actually female. So maybe it's like something about that is generating some unfairness, even if he's not such that he could just like dominate the competition. So I have to probably figure out a bit like why, whether it's justified to have that strong intuition that like, no, he's always taking something from women that is rightfully women's. Like he's doing something wrong there, even if he's not one of these like top 5% men.
Yeah. So then it sounds like the objection is still fundamentally metaphysical, perhaps, right? That this just, it's just in the sense that you just deny the basic assumption that this trans woman is a kind of woman. And so therefore, if this person were to win anything or be granted anything, it would be taken away from women.
Yeah, but I hope that's not what there is to it, because I don't want it to bottom out in nothing, right? So it's like, it's not just, it's political, right? So this has come up a lot of times in our just earlier discussion. The question is like, why is feminist politics justified? Like, what is it doing? Okay, well, then I have to tell you about the history of sport when it comes to women's exclusion or women's participation. And I have to tell you why it's important. There's all these like health benefits and career benefits. Like a surprising number of CEOs used to be in sport, like female-only sport. So, okay, so there's all these interesting things going on with the importance of sport, but it's not affirmative action, right? But it's like, it's somehow important still against the backdrop of history to get women into sport. So it's not just like a metaphysical thing about these like 2 types of people and this thing isn't for this one. but it's somehow more like a strongly political claim about why it's significant that there's like women's rugby, or make it something more competitive in the Olympics where you can win a lot of social status and prestige. Why it's bad there that a man who has had ample opportunities over there could be competing in that category for identity reasons has chosen to include himself, and the world has given that claim uptake in the women's category, and now is taking one of these like coveted high status or high reward money spots. It's like there's a political sense of injustice or unfairness or usurping or something there that like really bugs me. And that's a separate thing from this like empirical physiological distribution question of whether he would be likely to dominate, or whether in some sense he could compete fairly given the talent pool of the other women.
Yeah, that does kind of sound like that there's this fundamental disagreement over like the metaphysical claim of whether or not a trans woman or a type of woman, right? Because if you came at it with the assumption that a trans woman was a type of woman, then they wouldn't be unfairly taken away from a woman. You know what I mean? Like, because they're just like one kind.
Yeah, I sort of see what you're saying, but it's like it's such an incoherent claim, because what we should care about for politics is oppression, right? Or the history of oppression. And it's just false that trans women have that history. It was not trans women who were not even allowed to run in the marathon until a certain year. The trans woman he's male, he's eligible for the competition, he could run. Maybe he can't like proudly tell his woman identity on his t-shirt while he runs, or whatever. But so just for all these things throughout history, laws, social institutions, social practices where women have been excluded, it's females who have been excluded, and females as a class who have suffered those costs. So it's just, you're right in some sense that the trans activists can just say, like, I just dogmatically table thump assert that the two categories that matter are man and woman, and I mean them as identities, and I refuse to talk about anything else. Therefore, trans women and women, therefore, it's conceptually impossible for it to be wrong for a trans woman to take a spot or a prize dedicated to women. But it's like, there's a sense in which they're just blocking their ears and singing, right? Because I'm not talking about identity. I'm talking about femaleness and the whole history of thousands of years, whenever you want to put the like start of patriarchy and how you want to consider it. But yeah, of female subordination or male domination, however you want to characterize that, that's a sex-based phenomenon. It's not an identity one. And it's very easy to mobilize the empirical evidence to bolster that the trans women, men had the right to vote. Trans women, men could not be legally raped in marriage or whatever. Like, none of that stuff applies to them.
Yeah. So then the history is different, and the oppressions are different. And that's kind of, yeah. So then this brings me to the next question then. Like, I want people to be able to compromise on issues and figure out a solution that both sides can endorse, right? Like, whatever is going on, whatever conflict of the world right now just happens to be Israel and Palestine. I don't know enough about that issue, but it just sounds terrible, right? Yeah. Like, I kind of like this exercise of kind of like putting myself in the other person's shoes. Given that, trans people do face oppression, obstacles, and discrimination, what do you think they should be fighting for?
Trans rights.
Yes.
I think, no, that's the answer. Trans people should be fighting for trans rights, not for trans women to have women's rights. That is everything that creates the conflict. And there's absolutely no justification for it. They could get non-discrimination. They could get full uptake for all human rights that every human person is entitled to. They could get like respect and toleration for their identity claims without like forcing them on other people like a state-mandated religion. Trans people should be advocating for trans rights, anti-discrimination, non-vilification, and so on as trans. But it's a whole other thing to claim that in virtue of your identity, you are the thing you identify with, and therefore you deserve all of the rights and opportunities of that category. And there's no other case anywhere in the law that operates that way. Like, it's one of my huge bugbears that like the Equal Opportunity Act in Victoria lists separately sex and gender identity, but it interprets gender identity as changing your sex. So nowhere else could you do that. You couldn't say, I'm like, I've got religious protection as Jewish, so I count as Indigenous. Like, I can't think of a case to make it plausible. It's like, it's just no other protected characteristics work that way. You can fight for protections for your protected characteristic without claiming that they somehow magically change you into some other one. That's where I think things are going wrong and creating this huge conflict of interest between feminists and trans rights activists. And it's so easily resolved if they would just stop doing that.
So then it seems like that the fundamental disagreement does come down to like this metaphysical claim, right? Because I think what they're going to say, well, I don't know, I suspect what they're going to say is that gender identity is equally valid, right? So that
even if it's equally valid, it's not sex, right? The only way they can say that it's sex is if they give like a completely unscientific, ridiculous view of biology. So almost every reasonable person will agree that biological sex is a different phenomenon to one's sense of one's masculinity, femininity, neither, or whatever. Almost everyone can agree to that claim. You get some social constructionist, gender studies people who say like biological sex is a social construction, blah, blah, blah. Okay, set them aside. But almost everyone agrees those two things are different. So how could the person come back and say, even if they say they're equally important, we just need that they're not the same, and they're not the same. So then we should be able to just proceed in having the discussion about when sex is the thing that matters and when gender identity is, and how spaces should be divided up that were previously sex segregated, if there's any case for switching to gender identity segregation instead. And again, we're not having any of that discussion. They just table thump, insist that your gender identity changes or surpasses or replaces your sex because it's more important. No argument. Because the argument is that they feel strongly or something. And then everything that was previously, this is just a word game, because it was previously sex-separated spaces use the word woman and man, and they've changed the language so woman and man are identities. They just claim that all those spaces now are for identity and are trans-inclusive. That we haven't had that public discussion. We haven't like settled what's at stake and shifting that way. They just did that.
Interesting. Okay. The last point that I wanted to bring up is that it seems that there is such a strong and intimate connection between like the personal and the political, right? And like it's so hard to like disentangle the two. And I'm wondering if we can still do it. Okay, so this is what I mean. So just in terms of like using a person's preferred pronouns, right? It's an individual act that is related to some political struggle and political conflict, right?
Yeah.
And it just seems like to me that we like there could be two things going on, right? Like you can respect somebody's preferred pronouns, but also still kind of fight this political struggle. So the analogy that again, I don't think that I have like the perfect analogy, but one analogy that came up was religion, right? So or even something else like like patriotism or something like that, right? So let's say that you're a person who was anti-religious and maybe like anti-patriotic too. Like you just see that those are bad things, right? And the way you go to the way that you kind of voice your dissent and kind of fight for the cause is by saying certain things in certain circumstances, or doing certain things in certain circumstances, or not saying those things or not doing those things, right? So maybe like in terms of like religion, maybe I get invited over to some Thanksgiving, right? And the family is religious and they want to say grace,
Yeah.
And, I just kind of roll my eyes like, oh, brother, and like to my response to that, it's like, well, I don't think that that's the right time and the right place to do something like that, So I'm wondering if the same thing could be applied to something like this political conflict over sex and gender.
Yeah. Yes, certainly. I think that it happens a lot in our lives, right? That we have to decide which battles to pick, and we have to decide whether to prioritize our interpersonal relations rather than our whatever hobby horse we're riding at the time, whatever the expression is. Yeah, of course. And yeah, I would do the same thing. You go to, like, I'm not Jewish, but I go to a Jewish family's Shabbat dinner or whatever, and I'm doing the ritual stuff. That's just politeness, or it's respectful to kind of participate in other people's cultures or customs. I think I mean there's things where the more they're like close to our hearts and we feel strongly, the more we find ways to try to evade them because it feels like an integrity compromise. So for example, I've never said, I can't remember which one it's called, but there's welcome to country and acknowledgement of country. And one you're allowed to do when you're white. And they are just absolutely ubiquitous in Australia. Like some people do them at the start of every lecture. I've never done one and I don't like them. I think it's virtue signaling and they're meaningless. So I have these like objections where I would feel like such a fraud to stand up and do this quick like land acknowledgement thing. And also maybe because it's not my country, right? So something feels quite strange about that. So I go to quite great lengths to make sure I'm never the host of an event like, because then I would get put in the position of having to like conspicuously not do that. And maybe there's this question about pronouns there. So yeah, I'm very happy to go along with trans men's pronouns, but I feel quite uncomfortable going along with trans women's. But probably there's certain like relationships I'd prefer to preserve, or certain status hierarchies where I know I wouldn't be able to get away with it. Like I could, if I ever get included in a feminist philosophy conference ever again, I certainly can't just cheerfully use he where the other one uses she, like happened earlier in our discussion about a particular trans woman philosopher. So yeah, I think there's certainly a place where we all have to make these decisions, and strategic or interpersonal considerations can outweigh the political ones. And this certainly comes up in the debate within gender critical feminism about like how militant to be about pronouns. So, you know, I occasionally use trans women's pronouns if I would prefer to have the debate with them than not have it at all. And then I get piled on by the rad firms for calling a man he or whatever. So yeah, what am I saying overall? Yes, plenty of room to compromise, but you will get pushed back from the people who think you shouldn't be compromising in that way. And I guess there just is reasonable disagreement over like how much of your personal life to let be taken up by your politics, and how passionate it's okay to be about that particular political cause that you're involved in. And maybe it's more important to do so when fewer other people are resisting. So I think with gender critical feminists, we often feel like, man, everyone's got she, her in their email signature, and everyone's wearing the badge, and everyone's going along with this. So it becomes much more important to provide some sense that not everyone agrees with this stuff, or there's actually some interesting things to say about it. So you feel more like an obligation to state your disagreement where you might normally just be polite.
Yeah, I remember watching this debate. I didn't watch the whole thing. I just couldn't stand it. But it was about Israel and Palestine, you know. And there was like one host and then like two guests, right? And each guest was representing their particular side. And it was just like a yelling match, you know. Mm. And it was to the point where it didn't even seem like that one side who could acknowledge the truth in whatever the other side was saying, you know. It's just it was, they were so ingrained in their position. And like just seeing that, like if that is representative of the conflict, it will never end, you know. And it's just so, it really disheartens me, you know, because I really do feel like that we are creative enough and smart enough to figure out solutions to these problems. I mean, like, I feel like this is just one example of politics, right? I mean, what is politics? It's not just trying to figure out how to live with other people who want to live differently and have like conflicting interests and stuff like that, you know? And so I feel like there's got to be a way forward. And unfortunately, what I too often see is that people are unwilling to give any sort of ground. They dig in their heels and they start, you know, attacking each other, which then just makes it worse. And then it just escalates. And then it will get to the point where people just don't talk to each other, right?
Yes.
And that's what I really don't want to see.
I mean, one thing you could do, like as a podcaster and as a philosopher, I guess, is try to talk more to the other side about their no debate approach specifically, right? So you can't host the equivalent of the Israel-Palestine debate that you just mentioned with a gender critical feminist and a trans activist feminist philosopher. You can't. They won't. And like I know of at least two prominent universities here in America at the moment that are trying to organize this, and they can't get opponents. Okay, why? And so maybe the first step is like when you do talk to them about their views, they're often happy to talk to sympathetic interlocutors. They want a platform to publicize their side. But maybe more people need to be asking questions about the no debate approach, or trying to dig in a little bit to like, yeah, they're going to say that it's just like giving a violent misogynist a platform, or a Nazi or whatever. So getting to these like claims about when and why it's not appropriate to engage with views or give them airtime, and whether that's like a fair representation of the gender critical position. Maybe there are neutral parties like yourself and other people working on these issues where they can a bit like try to get to the bottom of the failure to discuss, so that we can get to the next stage of having the more constructive, less emotional conversations. And so then we can make some progress. Well, I know that sounds like a long pathway, but it's like we're nowhere on that trajectory yet, because we can't even get on the same screen or in the same room. And I find that it's like intellectually stultifying. But I don't know how to break that impasse. And I actually really genuinely don't know whether they believe it, that it's like that we're dehumanizing and so it would just be morally appalling to speak to us, or whether it's just a political strategy because they think their side is actually doing a lot better when it doesn't speak for itself and represent its arguments. Like they are doing pretty well so far. by refusing to debate and by just pretending we're morally repugnant. So maybe it's all a strategy. I really don't know.